mechanisms of international cooperation have failed the Global South, we will fix that with this model. Firstly on setup, then on principle, then on better policy. On setup, obviously the info slide gives you a lot of information. It's quick, it's fair, it's cheap, you ought to assume feasibility. And that 10%, you should assume that that works for whatever that looks like in each country. So some countries will be 10% of MPs, other countries it might be different things, but it will just be 10% of the government. What is our model? I want to be very clear here. Every person from every country will get a vote in every country's election that will go towards that 10% quota, but the weights of their votes will differ in two important ways. Firstly, to some extent, they will be inversely proportional to the GDP of their home country. And secondly, to some extent, they'll be inversely proportional to the population of their home country. So this means, for example, a citizen of Tuvalu would have a higher weight than a US citizen in this 10% comprisement of elections overseas. That is our model. Principle. Don't be fooled by the is-ought fallacy of the status quo. We believe that these people, everyone in the world, has a right to democratic representation in every other country. The structure of this principle is simple. Firstly, we prove that the decisions of governments have international effects. This should be obvious to you as the ordinary intelligent voter. The decisions of what trade policies countries choose to promote, the impact of their fossil fuel reduction schemes and their impact on climate change, the impact on global politics and the risk of conflict, the impact of colonialism that still exists today, those are all things that meaningfully impact the lives of people around the world, often to a much greater extent than many of these issues impact domestic populations. They don't deserve an equal say as the people living in their home countries, because obviously people in home countries have more of a, more connection to that country, but they definitely deserve 10%. That's a good number to pick. We think that versions of the state power principles here about domestic governments also apply here. A large international government has the power to influence people's lives, to meaningfully restrict their freedoms. That is something that we ought to give those people a say over how they use them. Why then are current mechanisms to guarantee them this sort of representation ineffective? The first thing to note is negotiations between different countries systematically favor the wealthy countries because they have more to negotiate with, they have less to lose. The second thing to note is that leaders do a bad job of holistically representing their nations at institutions like the United Nations. Often they have political agendas that aren't representative of their whole states. But the third thing to note is even if they were, institutions like the UN are ineffective. They are not binding, countries have vetoes. Just look at the Israel-Palestine conflict. The UN clearly is insufficient to secure the rights of those people. Weigh this principle because these people deserve representation. And of course, representation isn't really something you can tangibly quantify in debates, but it is still something valuable nonetheless, and it's something you should weigh highly against practical impacts that this team will bring. I also think there is a separate principal benefit of people with relatively poor access to democratic rights, like they might be in a state that has a relatively weak democracy, has lots of gerrymandering and stuff like that, now just do get a lot more engagement in democracy, get ability to vote in elections that do affect their lives to some extent. That's a separate benefit that we're also able to prove. So, why do we get better policy? The first thing I want to explain is when this 10% quotient is likely to meaningfully change the policy that happens and is proposed and is voted on and the governments that get elected. There are three situations where I think that is likely. The first is where a particular policy or policy platform has some support internally, but has more support externally, or vice versa. So policies such as climate change emissions and carbon caps, those sorts of things often have more support in the developing world, for example, which would form a higher proportion of the votes here than they would in many developed nations' internal domestic politics. But there is still some internal domestic support for those policies, so this might be the tipping point that gets them over the line. The second reason that this might change policy is if there's something that is very strongly and unanimously, or almost unanimously, supported or exposed externally, but is not as much of an issue internally. So something like the war in Gaza, for example, is something that isn't as contentious in Israel as it is overseas. It's much more likely that you're able to marginally change the composition of Israel's government and their position on those issues if you have 10% of the voice coming from an almost unified group of representatives of the international community that oppose that position. But thirdly, there are just some policies that are mutually beneficial if all countries enacted them, but they often fail due to game theory problems, right? So policies like free trade and protectionism protectionism to prevent free trade often end up harming all countries, but they're more likely to go through if other countries know they have a stake in every other country, which means that those policies are more likely. What are the impacts and what are the sorts of policies that we get? Why is that worth this model? The first thing I would note is that the campaigning that politicians do in these countries is likely to get better, is likely to be more productive, is likely to be more focused on policy. That is for two key reasons. Firstly, you're less likely to have politicians who fully alienate the international population. You're far less likely to have racist rhetoric towards foreigners, because if you significantly alienate foreigners, you're losing a decent chunk of your voting population. And you're less likely to have things like anti-immigration policy. You're less likely to have things like nationalism and America First rhetoric, for example. Those are the sorts of policies that are necessarily in the status quo exclusionary to the global population, but they get away with it because there's no accountability on that exclusionariness, and that's something that they can't get away with now. The second reason this might happen is that I think there's more of a focus, the second reason that campaigning is better is because there is more of a focus on ideology in campaigning as opposed to persona of individual politicians. The reason for this is every year there will be many, many elections around the world that people have to vote in. And in order to make any sense of all the elections going around the world, because most global citizens obviously can't keep up with the issues in every single country, the parties have to distill their policy platforms into broad ideological positions that can be aligned across a multitude of countries. And obviously they can highlight specific issues in their country as well, but it does just mean that it's more likely that you're going to vote for the liberal candidate or the conservative candidate in that country, which is more aligned with those broad political beliefs. The second impact of this sort of policy is you're obviously going to have issues prioritized that help the developing world. This is for a few reasons. Firstly, because our model specifically amplifies the voices of these voters, but even if you didn't buy that, like if you thought this model was illegitimate, which you shouldn't, this would just mean that numerically there's a lot more people here. And this ought outweigh any arguments you might get, like, oh, these people are less invested in politics, they have less time to vote. The info slide assumes that it's super easy and they have access to that as well. And also, I just think that you're more likely to get media attention on issues that affect people around the world. This means you get policy on climate change, you get proper targets to stop fossil fuel emissions, you get a range of other policies that are reparative and stop colonial damage. That is something that's beneficial. The third impact that you get is you reduce the worst harms of pariah states. And yes, you're probably not going to fix North Korea, you're probably not going to fix Iran outright, but for states like Israel, where there is some link to the democratic world, they are probably going to have more of an ability to listen to the international community, more of an incentive to do so, more of a capacity to do so. That is a benefit. You stop the worst atrocities that those states can do to some extent. Fourthly, you get closer global political and economic positions. That is to say, when you have formed broad ideological coalitions across many states across the world, where you have the enabling of things like free trade for the reasons I've said earlier, that means that prisoner's dilemma is overcome. More people are able to claim the benefits of an interlinked global economy, claim the benefits of an interlinked global politics that is less hostile to other members of that nation because they're more connected to their interests. Fifthly, people are more informed of global politics. They're more likely to care about what's going on in other nations because they have an ability to vote in those nations, and they know those nations have an ability to vote in their elections. They're also more likely to resist things like aggression and war because they have more of a stake in their issues as well. I just also think there are more globalist and pro-immigration policies across the board. That is a clear benefit. Look, this is a very different world to the status quo, but it is a better world and you ought to support it.
That would have been a great speech if this was a World Schools debating final. But unfortunately, we can't just put out airy-fairy benefits and impacts and fail to prove the premises that lead to them. Because at no point did this opposition ever explain why this 10% of politicians would actually be listened to, why they would actually be able to meaningfully change the way that policy is done. And indeed, that will be the second argument we present to you about why politics is in fact harmed and ineffective. But firstly, I'm going to explain our principle, and then thirdly, our third argument will be about backlash. So, what is our principle? Obviously, and this is surely unexpected to everyone in the room, people have a right to control their own government, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, the government exerts an inordinate amount of direct control over you, not only in the way that they construct laws that pertain to what you can and can't do, but also in the way that they fund and execute services, in the way that they choose to, to allocate police officers to certain places, in the way that they choose to fund police to do certain things, in the way that they enact different policies. That is critical because that level of granularity is exactly what the opposition loses when they literally explain to you that politicians will have to distill their policies in order to make it compatible and accessible to voters around the world. So even if you take them at their best and you think that the average global voter would have the best interests of the country in mind, they wouldn't even be able to make an informed choice because they cannot access that level of granularity. They do not speak their language, which means that a lot of the nuance of the policy or the presidential or MP debates that occur on French television would just be completely inaccessible to the vast majority of people around the world. But obviously, people who actually live through those things have a far better incentive and capacity to understand and enact on that. But the second part of this principle is that obviously you give your own money to the government in forms of tax, and therefore you have a reciprocal obligation. Now, obviously, our principle is still discharged by the opposition to some extent because they have 90% of MPs being voted by you. But we would argue that that 10% is incredibly important. Now, I'm not as good as rhetoric as Will is because he made this argument very, very well in round 3 earlier today. That 10% is in fact critical because every extra amount every extra dilution of your power over the government that occurs is damages your ability to control them and damages your ability to do things that are in your interest. But the second aspect of this principled argument is that the international community actually just has no right to control what your government does, and that's for 4 reasons. The first is that this comes at a cost of your ability to control what your government does, as I just explained. The second is to simply observe that the international community is less affected by the things that are decided in such elections that you are deciding. That is to say, most people don't vote for their governments on the basis of foreign policy or certain trade decisions. They often prioritise much more local things like economic benefits to them. For example, if you think about the recent Australian elections, the main thing was which will tackle the cost of living crisis more. That is something that the international community has no say in, rather than the types of foreign policy that the opposition wanted to talk about. But the third thing that I would observe is that there are already existing mechanisms which, contrary to what this opposition say, are actually effective enough at discharging their principled burden. You can go to forums like the UN or the World Trade Organizations. There are treaties like free trade agreements that you can opt into signing. But most importantly, there are institutions that can defend you and are frequently successful in defending you, such as the ICJ. So that when a company engages in a policy when a country engages in a policy that screws you over, you have some amount of recourse. And indeed, you can see that the Philippines has sued Australia and been successful in that, and there are a myriad of other examples. Just because you make some decisions that affect other countries does not mean they have a right to control you. Imagine, just because you can't regulate the type of car your neighbour buys beyond certain things like how much noise it makes. This is what we are arguing for. You would be able to. You do have a right for them not to punch you, but you obviously don't have a right for them to determine what type of car that they purchase. That is the comparative in this debate. Okay. Second argument then, on political harm. A couple of things here. Firstly, I want to explain why at best this is just an ineffective way, but at worst it's obstructionist or even malicious. And then finally, I'm going to talk about harms in developing democracies and the effects to actual voting in and of itself. So, why is this simply ineffective? 2 reasons. The first is that there just literally is no global consensus on many policy issues. Many of the things that people in this room would take for granted, like redistribution of wealth, cooperating internationally, or even just having a free media. Many countries and many citizens do not value those things as much as we do because they instead value different things where they think other things are more important. That is all to say, your 10% of people simply would not be able to agree on something or might in fact have completely contrasting perspectives to the rest of the MPs that they're working with. And that leads us to the second mechanism here, which is that in many cases there would be an extreme lack of cohesion between this 10% of MPs that are from overseas and literally everyone else. And that is, I guess, because they can't necessarily speak the language or there are just certain cultural differences between them, but also because they don't necessarily have the expertise to understand standing laws in your parliament or certain procedures that might otherwise occur that might at the very best case make them look a little bit inept, but at the worst case might attract the ire of other MPs. I would also note as well that some countries disproportionately have the ability to pick better representatives. So for example, America probably can find someone, within their 300 million people that speaks the language of every country that they want to, put a politician in that like can represent and know those things. But that is not a plausible thing for most other countries, especially smaller ones. So they would not be able to actually use the platform that the opposition gives them in an effective way. The final thing that I would note is that there would be extraordinary vote fatigue. That is to say, if you follow like the recent EU elections, literally everyone is begging EU 18 and 20-year-olds to vote because so many people are disengaged from the system. Imagine if you literally had to vote in every single election around the world. You would obviously stop caring because there are like 50 of them a year. And most importantly, you would start voting based on heuristics rather than actual analysis of the policy. That is to say, not only does it mean that the people creating the policy now have to dumb it down for you, as the opposition literally explained, it means you are more likely just to vote for Macron because he's like a Giga Chad compared to Marine Le Pen, or vice versa, whatever you think. You're much more susceptible to personality politics, especially in the age of Instagram and TikTok influencers and all that sort of stuff. You're much more susceptible. Next thing though is that people can literally just be obstructionists. Obviously, I already explained that there's no global consensus. And so that's why, in part, you could be obstructionist, but you might also just maliciously be obstructionist in a couple of ways. The first is that you could, simply just submit a lot of legislation or a lot of items for consideration to stop a country from actually passing its policy or passing the policy that really matters. You might make really long speeches. You might just jam up the procedural workings of Parliament. And obviously, it's the big countries that have an incentive to do that. But I would note that even small countries might want to interfere with other small countries, because you shouldn't just think the world is about big people screwing over smaller people. Everything is comparative, and it is a zero-sum world, which means that even if you preference small countries in this system, you might just have one small country that wants to beat another small country. And I would observe that because of the West, which has made many small countries share economies and economic things, for example, like much of Southeast Asia does textile manufacturing, you might just get situations where people want to screw over their neighbours so that their economy can profit. I guess that leads me into the malicious idea. Obviously, the other way that people can be malicious is that you literally now just have access to state secrets, about their economic plans, about the military capabilities, and you ought not overestimate this, because MPs do sit on Senate committee, or they do sit on intelligence committees and things like that. But even if this opposition now wants to retrospectively model that out, I would note that because you often you have the ability to leverage your way onto those committees because it helps you make better decisions, and that's how you can explain it to people. And so you are able to abuse some countries in a capacity, and obviously that is asymmetric because bigger countries are able to do a better job of that. At the end of this speech, then, we explain to you why this is going to be ineffective at best, malicious and obstructive at worst, and why people have a principled right to represent their own country, and that's it. Round of applause.
Firstly on rights, then on backlash, then on policy. Let's start with the affirmative principle. Their claim, boiled down, is that people who are part of the international community are affected when states do things, therefore they should control the manner in which states do things. The problem with this argument is it's not sufficient to demonstrate an obligation. People are often affected by other things. That doesn't mean you have a right to control those things. Here are some easy examples. The clothes my neighbour might wear affect me in some sense, but I do not have a right to decide what clothes they wear. Whether or not someone wants to date me or be my friend or have a relationship with me affects me. I have no right to control whether or not that occurs. Whether or not a country wants to trade with me, or a person wants to trade with me, or a person wants to associate with me, does affect me, but I should not have the right to control whether they do that, because it would be a fundamental violation of their freedom of association and their own rights. So just because something affects you, that is insufficient to establish that an obligation exists. Even if it affects you a lot, as a relationship might, even if it affects you very intensely and you care about it a lot. And that is all the analysis they give. It's just repeating the fact that you're affected a lot, which does not a principle make. We, importantly, distinguish our principle as to why states owe you obligations from this specific claim. That is, we point out the difference is that states claim rights over citizens, which establishes reciprocal obligations. States say they have sovereignty and jurisdiction over certain people. They say that they have a right to make those people obey laws. They say they have a right to tax those people. That is what makes a specific reciprocal obligation exist. That is not true, because states do not claim authority over people who do not live in their own jurisdiction. They do not claim rights over them, which is why no reciprocal obligations exist. Their principle is entirely uncomparative in the debate. At third affirmative, we get a Hail Mary by saying, well, we also have a new principle, which is giving people the right to vote in countries where they otherwise would not have the right to vote. Notably, one, not in the election they actually want to vote in, like Chinese people get to vote in the American election, which is not a right, one, that they've proven it should exist, but two, is not a right that is even intuitively useful to these people. They don't get the right that they want. But secondly, I think this hints at a very useful tension in their case. Because clearly the interests of the Chinese government in some instances might not be quite aligned with the interests of the Chinese voters who get to vote in the US election. Who do you think the United States is going to care more about? The elites in China who have control over nuclear weapons and the armed forces, or the voters in China who say, hey, actually, we want you to engage in this policy that's quite hostile to the government that we have here? It suggests exactly why this voting is unlikely to be effective, is likely to be ignored by other factors, and is likely to wash out. So, how should you then weigh this principle, even if you're somewhat sympathetic to what affirmative has given you so far? 3 points. The first thing we point out is we give many reasons why the most severe effects occur domestically and not internationally. So even if you're somewhat sympathetic to the idea that being affected by something gives you control, they're diluted by the fact of distance, jurisdiction, and existing rules that constrain the worst effects of states, like war being illegal, diplomacy being constrained by international relations. Secondly, I want to point out the asymmetry of the effect in their argument, because their principle relies on you proving that they actually do get to control policy in the countries, because their principle is you should have a right to control it. If they don't actually give you the right to control it meaningfully, their principle doesn't work, but ours does not rely on that mechanism. So our principle is not contingent, but theirs is. Finally, I would note that our explanation practically as to why they're likely to obstruct politics explains that it's not like a one-to-one trade-off of maybe we dilute the say of domestic people a little bit, but we give international people a say. It's that you might entirely prevent people domestically from having accountability over their governments if, for example, their government is totally obstructed and gridlocked and prevented from passing any policy. The severity of that harm is sufficiently high that that will be a mechanism that you weigh. And this matters in the debate because we say this is a very fundamental right, it's a very important right. Affirmative doesn't challenge the importance of this principle. They lean into its importance in order to make their own principle, which is exactly why this wins the debate for the first time for the affirmative team. Let's then engage in the question of backlash. Sophie gives you a range of reasons why voters would be very upset by this policy and why they would have deleterious consequences. We get 2 responses at third affirmative. The first is to say we would fiat it out. No. If the topic were that we should ban smoking, you would have fiat to ban smoking. You would not have fiat to make people not want to smoke or to want to ban smoking. Like that is clearly outside the bounds of what they could do. Secondly, they say wealthy countries still have power so voters will not be upset. Like what? Just because you have some of something still doesn't mean you're not upset to lose a lot of it. And in fact, the fact that they have so much now is exactly why they feel entitled to that power and be so upset to lose it in the first place. They say, why do we care if they lose it? Because as this team concedes down the bench time and time again, these countries have the power to fuck over smaller countries and seem very willing to do so per this team's characterization. And per our characterization, are very upset and now want to really screw over the countries they see as interfering in their own politics. That is why you should care about it. If you think countries behave poorly at the moment, are they more or less likely to do so when they're xenophobic, fired up by these other countries attempting to control them, and believe in globalist conspiracies about those countries trying to hold them down? Clearly a reason why you should care about our argument. And we impact this very well. We explain it affects things like buy-in, not just in the richest countries, but often in the weakest democracies, where people already kind of think that their vote doesn't matter, and now they're told, actually an American is going to vote in your election and determine a large amount of your policy. Actually, the people in China get to determine what happens in your country. It's those people who give up, but it also means that in the most important countries per this team's characterization, people hold their governments to less account because they don't trust them, because they don't believe their vote is as effective, they don't believe that voting matters as much. That is important because they can see those governments can do really bad things. But secondly, it's all of the harms they point to, things like being anti-immigrant, anti-trade, etc. Then I get much worse when people are more racist and more populist because they feel a need to do so. Politicians feel a need to rile up the 90%, which is much more important, to push against the 10% that will upset voters. Finally then, on policy. I want to note just a few easy responses that knock out huge parts of the claims that this team makes. The first one is that they need to explain why the international community could express a coherent and unified voice on issues in order to bring about change. Noting they only have 10% of the vote, and if that's further subdivided into many different positions, that's not going to do anything. We give you many reasons that won't happen. Firstly, there are 8 billion people. Secondly, national politics in countries like Australia that have very few people are very contentious and split amongst many opinions. When you add in billions of additional people, that suggests that you get more divergence in what people want, not more coherence. But thirdly, even the most universal principles are divisive. Like, this team can't point to a single example of a principle everyone believes in. For example, they say, like, we point to examples like democracy or civil rights that are very controversial in many countries and do not exist by popular will in those countries. But even think about their examples. They're like free trade, neoliberal conspiracy according to at least half the world's population. They point to climate action, like many developing countries think it's a conspiracy to prevent them from developing and prevent them from burning fossil fuels in order to become richer. Thirdly, they say regime change in Israel. Yes. Unanimous support for that proposal. Like, think about what they say will occur. Do any of these things sound at all like something that people would be unified over? They say it doesn't matter. Like, maybe we just express the various nuances of what people believe. It does matter because your principle is that people will control these governments and change the way that they act. If they don't, that falls out. But we explain the harm is massive. It seems like obstructionism because now 10% of parliament, either intentionally, as we say is the most likely thing people will vote for governments to do, just like fuck up other countries because it'll prevent bad things from happening or prevent things from changing, or just because they're all fighting against each other, prevent things like policy passing. Because of things like, filibusters, majority requirements, procedural requirements, and easy ways you can jam up elections, it's very easy for even one person to just prevent anything from occurring here. And the effects here are asymmetric, as we explained. China gets a say over the US, but the US doesn't get a say over China, which explains exactly why this is unfair. The most cooperative and democratic countries get screwed, the least cooperative and democratic countries get more say at the table.
We gifted this negative team so much counter feedback, and they used absolutely none of it. So the question you must ask yourself at the end of the day, what really is the harm that they are saying is going to be so bad? Because we're able to outline a pretty clear series of policies that are much more likely to get passed. And counter to what they assert down the bench, we give you the reasons that those policies are likely to be passed. That was the first 3 reasons I give in my practical. I explained situations where it's likely to be the tipping point into getting policy change. But importantly, we rigged our models such that poor nations would always get their way, and you would always have unanimous support as much as you could on things like climate change that uniquely affect those poor nations. And that means that the benefit we're able to sell you might not be that diverse, like it might just be a few key issues that are really important to the majority of the world, but those issues are likely to get a positive change, and I think that outweighs the various quibbles we get from this team. First on policy, then on backlash, then on principle. On policy, this team's strategy is to make you forget how clear our benefits were. But our claims were essentially both that this parliament was more representative, but also that it empowers less economically developed countries. And the impacting of that was clear. They agreed that the impacting was clear. Thank you. Negative team's attacks. Firstly, this would never change anything. There would never be consensus amongst this 10%. But we preempted this. We outlined the situations where it would. And yes, on most issues, you would just not get a majority, and it absolutely wouldn't affect the politics of that country at all, right? Like, if this is just a deadweight 50-50 split on every other issue, those issues aren't going to change the domestic politics. It's a non-issue in this debate. Then they give some material to explain that these people, like, they might vote poorly. They don't have good translators. They don't, they aren't in tune with the issues. But we explain not only does the info slide lend us easy access to overcome a lot of these issues, but we use our analysis to flip a lot of these issues. We explain why actually you get a more ideological approach that's better suited to broad voting coalitions, where you're more likely to be provided information from a changed media diet. Then they give various nitpicks that you might have a chilling effect on MPs, you might not have a CIA. We just flip that material as well. We explain why that material either doesn't matter, or it's better on our side where you're actually able to get better ones. But I just think you all weigh at the end of this point. On the issues that matter the most, that are existential threats to the world, we are the ones that get tangible change that empowers the least empowered. They have a suite of nitpicks which are short-term and to a large extent merely mitigatory. You ought not weigh them highly. Let's talk about backlash, because despite only being provided with one speech in which to do so, we mitigate this very, very well. What do we prove to you? Firstly, that this is something by virtue of fiat power that is democratically arrived on. Yes, like we don't have fiat to say everyone agreed, but it is something that the government supported. We also explain that it's reciprocal. So yes, someone gets to vote in your election, but you get to vote in someone else's election, and that means that you're less angry about it because you get the same power that they get. Thirdly, we explained that it fades over time, because yes, there are new elections every time, but people get used to the system over time, and that's something that people adjust their expectations for. But finally, we flipped this material right back in my speech, where we explain why people's campaigning incentives change. They're less xenophobic, they're less likely to alienate these groups because they need to get them on side to get that 10%. Finally, on principle. Our principle was simple. The international community deserves a say on issues that affect them. We get 3 critiques from side negative. Firstly, they're not affected as much, but that's why they get a much smaller piece of a much smaller pie. They're just a tiny number in a 10% fraction that is representative of the fact that they are affected less. The second critique, well, this burden would be discharged anyway from other teams. And they have, mechanistic quibbles with some of the UN material, for example, but they don't engage with the underlying structural reason that all of these systems are biased towards rich countries, biased towards rich citizens. Their final attack at third negative is just because something affects something, that is insufficient. But their principle, counter to what they say, also relies on affecting people. And they have new substantive at third to say, well, no, it's because states claim that they have power over people. But they also have reparative colonial obligations, for example, obligations to global peace and security. They claim those rights, those obligations as well. The principle stands for our side. You shouldn't believe their defense of it. For all those reasons, vote affirmative.